Okay, sorry about that.
Can you see it?
That looks good.
Okay, so yeah, thank you, Thanasis and Kristen, for inviting us to do this quick presentation as part of the first webinar. I'm just going to give a few minutes of background and of what we've been doing, and then Karen's going to do a quick demo. We've been working with conservators for many years, and we needed to learn more about their requirements for a documentation system. We initiated a conservation working group that originally lasted about 3 years. The working group was extended to a 4th year to focus on time-based media and complex installation works. We worked with conservators from about 50 different institutions that were already clients of Gallery Systems. We then set out to create the application that we released in 2016 called Conservation Studio. Throughout the development phase, we met individually with conservation departments to show our progress and get their feedback. Conservation Studio is now in its 4th release, and we've continued to refine our approach to providing a solution that meets the needs of conservators and collections care staff, as well as technicians, registrars, and curators. It is a conservation documentation system that deals with projects ranging from restoration of a single masterwork to complex projects involving hundreds of objects that require workflow coordination, condition reports, image annotation, treatment proposals, reports, scientific analyses, and etc. It is configurable and able to handle the specific needs of different types of objects of various media, artifacts, and specimens. Conservation Studio is integrated with our suite of applications and has direct access to all related data about objects, constituents, media, exhibitions, loans, location, thesauri, and user security, among other things. We include ourselves in the group that Kristen described, who are studying the potential of linked conservation data, not yet doing it. We are particularly interested in use cases for linked conservation data and believe that we can be helpful in supporting the sharing of data in our application. When we joined the Linked Conservation Data Project, Thanasis and Kristen asked that we give a brief demonstration of Conservation Studio as a way for participants to see an example application for conservation documentation. Karen will give a 10 to 15 minute demonstration of some concepts and mention some of the challenges related to standardizing conservation documentation for sharing. Because we only have a few minutes, the demonstration will be very high level.
Yeah. Before I go forward, I just want to pick up on some of the things in this slide, because when we were working on Conservation Studio, basically what we were doing is some of you might be familiar with the TMS application. What it has for conservation is a fixed set of fields relating to the object record. Among the things that you can do in TMS are links to thesauri and things like that, but the fields have specific names and they're in a specific table. When we were starting to think about Conservation Studio, we wanted to do something much more flexible. What we heard from the Conservation Working Group, the Conservation Working Group included conservators from many different specialties. So paper, objects, time-based media, all kinds of things. And so what happened is their needs and requirements were sort of briefly in lots of different directions, because every single conservator, every single lab does a lot of different kinds of documentation all at the same time. And what we saw out in the field is that it's not even that each museum would have one conservation system if they even had any. Often they had multiple, because as they were working on individual projects, they would build a FileMaker Pro database or an Excel spreadsheet or something like that. So this issue of sharing, even within a single museum, even in a single lab, can be a really complex thing to deal with from a data perspective. As it says in the slide, conservators have a history of building standalone databases for specific projects. That means it's quite difficult to share. Conservators are also often very standards-based. And so what that would mean historically is often they're going to these external thesauri and turning them into pick lists that no longer have a connection to the thesauri they came from. They're using them as reference material, not necessarily as things to link with. Another issue that we hit with some of this is volume that conservators have. Anything that we build has to be very easy to use, very easy to enter the data. So coming forward quickly, these are some of the examples of the requests that came to us in terms of things various people wanted to track. So we have things from rugs, not related things, paper related things. I'll show you all of these things, how they translate into a database where we try and take these specific things and pull them into a generic extensible data structure that can be shared within the museum, across the museum. These are controlled vocabulary, these are long text fields, lots of them. So basically what we had to do is, as we're thinking about sharing between institutions, between museums, so that we can have common reports, common data entry forms to the extent conservators want them. A big demand was to build their own, but sometimes also to share screens, reports, things like that. We have to be able to map from specific databases through a mapping table into a set of common IDs. This is how we find the combination between sharing and standards and also the flexibility that each specific institution, specialty, et cetera, needs. So now what I'm going to do is show you Conservation Studio and show you some of the ways that this sort of abstractness translates into practice. Hold on, we have to maybe minimize the screen. Here we go. Let's see. No, hold on. Here we go. Okay, just a second. I hope you can see this. It's because I didn't spell it right. Hold on 1 second, just quickly figuring out the servator. Here we go. Okay, sorry about that. So this is Conservation Studio. One of the main things in designing this is the integration between conservation application and the collections management system. So underlying this is a connection between the live collections management cataloging system and conservation reports. I'm going to come directly into the conservation reports module. This is a separate module which can be accessed either through an object or directly on its own terms. So just to give you a little bit of an orientation of what we're looking at here, we're in the conservation reports module. You always see the name of the module up at the top left. Over on the left-hand side, you're seeing this record's relationship to other things in the database. So this conservation report is linked to an object, it's linked to a project, that's an exhibition, it's conservation relating to an exhibition. It's linked to a person, a constituent, media records, and bibliography. So even from the beginning, you see this record's relationship to other things within this database, and that's really important to things like workflow, understanding this report in conflict, those kinds of things. Another thing that's important is multiple users might be in this database. This particular record has restricted access. One of the balances we find with sharing is conservation data is often highly confidential. So we have to find that balance between access and sharing in everything that we design. So what I'm going to do is show you a series of records and show you how that complex web of requests that we get sort of gets both abstracted and made specific in the application. Be aware that none of this data I'm showing you is real. We sort of have various conditions and things linked to the wrong objects. You might see things as conservators that make your jaw drop, but it's all fake demo database. Important to know at the outset. So this is just an example of one of the approaches conservators sometimes take. You see at the top the link to the exhibition. In general, we find when we design these screens that it's best to find as much as possible that runs in common against all the kinds of reports. So up at the top, we have things like the examiner, due date, begin date, common information that would be shared, linked media. And then this particular approach, which is common among a lot of conservators, is wanting to enter data in text. And this is also an issue with sharing, where we need to find common IDs for these text fields, so that they can be shared. It's not linking to a thesaurus, but it's another thing where the field name and contents can be in common between databases with conservators in different departments and different institutions. So again, this particular one, lots of text, and then some environmental requirements, which is also a place where there's opportunity for building common vocabularies that can be shared for storage and display requirements for particular kinds of objects. I'm going forward into another record. Again, this is to show you, you have to think of these in some ways as we're building things up out of abstract building blocks. So this is another record for the same object, fake record, mind you. And I'm just going to come down and show you a different approach on this one, right? So this is one where there's more structure behind it, sort of a survey where we might have, if something has abrasion, flaking, etc., just clicking the box. So it's very easy data entry from a selected pick list. And these are things that are appropriate to paper, right? So you're seeing flaking, fading, staining, darkening, embrittlement, even though the database contains multiple other criteria. For this particular screen, we're pulling just things appropriate to paper, to this kind of object. And then I'm coming through again, just to give you a sense of this, how we abstract things that to a conservator are actually very specific. So this is an example of a rug. And I just want to show you a couple of things here, the differences between paper and the commonalities. So up at the top, we have these same shared fields. These are important because it helps us search across the database. So even though these forms are all different, and in the past might actually have been recorded in different databases, here we're pulling them together in a common structure. Right, so here we have rug-specific things. We're using the same structure. When I showed you in the PowerPoint, I showed you that list of things people asked us for. This is basically pulled from that list and shows how we're able to use this flexible structure to get specific. So here you're seeing things like types of knots, types of rugs. And down here, general object condition, notice how these both overlap and don't with what I showed you for paper. Right, so here we have brittleness. It's basically the same field as for paper, but then we have some specific things just for textiles, like fraying and tears and staining and those kinds of things. I want to show you how this can translate into other things as you're documenting the record. One of the things that's part of the system is an annotation system. And what we can do is combine information from the conservation report up here in the annotation. So when you see these things over on the side, missing pile, staining, adhesive, broken warp, these are taken directly from the conservation report. So there's a correspondence between the annotation and the underlying conservation report. What you would see over here would be different if I showed you an annotation for a drawing. It would be entirely different from what I'm showing you for a rug, right? Notice broken warp, those kinds of things, how specific that is. Another thing I want to show you, there are different structures that we can use as we're doing this. In general, what we find requested are text and checkboxes, but there are other approaches that are really relevant as we're trying to move into linked data. And I'm just giving you a comparison here of two ways you can do it. You can see some of the challenges as well. This is the same data that I just showed you, just in a different format. It's possible to have different versions of forms and screens. So we're still in that same demo rug survey record, just looking at it from a different perspective. So here's the drop down for type of notch that you might have noticed in the other version of the screen, and the checkbox to show this is a pile rug. What I did in preparation for this was to just have a look at what this would look like if we tried to do the same data linking to the AAT, the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus, which is in our world with our client base, that's probably the most used of the big thesauri out there. So rug knots, here in this database, we have a drop down of a few values with a bunch of different descriptive things here. This type is Turkish, symmetrical, Persian, asymmetrical. Just want to show you what we get when we open the thesaurus and see what we get from the Getty AAT, right? So here we're seeing, in terms of potential and data entry challenges, we're seeing both here. So when I pull this up from the Getty AAT, I can see all of the different variations, all of the different versions of how this type of knot might be referred to. So that's interesting. That's information I don't get just from my dropdown. However, what I also get here are knots that might not be in the pick list that I want our lab to be using. We've broken it down to 2 or 3 specific ones. When I'm tying into the AAT in this way, I'm seeing a much longer list, which is put together by someone else. So as we're thinking about how we can translate from a data entry perspective, from a control perspective, this balance between linking externally and shaping it, tailoring it internally, this is one of the interesting sort of data entry perspectives, which is one of the things that maybe gallery systems can bring when we're looking at this, not only from a data perspective, but also from a perspective of how do users use this? How do we make it easy for users to actually use these really useful structures? So the last one I want to show you is an example of how these structures can be used, not just for traditional objects, but also for things like time-based media. Because as I said, the flexibility of these data structures is tremendous. So here we're sharing the same things at the top: examiner, due date, begin date, those kinds of things. Using the same building blocks that were used on the report for paper and rugs and those kinds of things, we're just giving them different names and different field names. So for something like this, we have input signals and devices and partitioning and color bar references. All of these things, again, in the same database, so that we can come into this set of conservation reports and move between them, even though they're very, very different. It shows you an example of the flexibility of this abstract data structure and what we can do with it. Notice as I go from record to record, I'm getting an appropriate form. That's because we're also mapping screens to types of conservation reports. So I'm never going to see this stuff if I come into a rug. I'm going to get the appropriate screen for what I'm trying to enter. So the other thing I want to show you a little bit with this record is how things link together. So far I've been showing you just conservation reports, but that link between the collections management system, conservation reports, exhibitions, all of those things is also really, really important. So in this case, this is just one time-based media report for this record. I'm going to navigate over to it. In Conservation Studio, we don't see everything from the object cataloging system. We're just seeing a subset of things relevant to conservators. So for example, for this time-based media record, a film, we're seeing all of these components listed, which can be very important to this kind of installation. And if I come down here, I just want to show you from the object perspective what you see. In the conservation reports module, you're seeing links to various modules. The same is true in the objects module. Again, you can see we're in the object module up at the top left. If I click on conservation reports, I see all of the reports related to this record. I can open this up and I can access it from here as well. And I'm just using this to show you the relationships, but also the variety of things that you can do. So from the single place, I can see the digitization, that's what I just showed you. I can see information relating to the installation. This is the generic information about the installation. Notice how these forms change. So here it's a text-based thing. Same need for IDs to be able to share these reports across institution, internal IDs. And as the last one, I'll just show you this iteration report using the same building blocks, right? So that the way we've needed to work as we've been trying to balance the specific needs of as we said in this slide, the different specialties, workflows within a single lab. This is an example of how time-based media, it's not just one data entry form, there are multiple data entry forms needed for the same object by the same conservator. So that's the balance that we're trying to find between specific things, specific institutions, conservators, et cetera, need balanced with the general. And it's only by finding these shared IDs, these shared structures, these shared vocabularies, that's what makes it possible for this data to be shared. So we get away from the individual FileMaker Pro database, the individual Excel spreadsheet, and we get into a place where we can share this information. And as we said, both within an institution, even that is a challenge, and ideally across institutions where we get to a place where we can share our research, we can share our loan forms, we can share our reports, all of that. Want to say anything?
I think that our time's probably up at this point, but as you can tell from what Karen is saying, we're definitely supportive of taking the approach of focusing on vocabularies, linked data vocabularies, glossaries, authorities, et cetera, as part of the beginning of this project. So, thank you.